Hello, and welcome to session 3 of the FHIR for Developers introductory series. My name is Gino Canessa, as usual, and today we're going to talk about the Smart App Launch Framework. So this is the authorization piece. Last time we were talking to open servers via HTTP, which is great for development, great for testing, not so great for protecting health information. So this is the standardized layer that goes on top of that in order to protect it. And it was very important to define a standard way so that people can have applications that can log into any FHIR server without worrying about which protocols they're using and everything else. So before we jump in, there is a lot of content on this area. It's a very well documented area and one with a lot of videos and tutorials. So I'm just going to go through everything kind of briefly, just to give kind of an overview. And as always, there are links in GitHub in the repo here to kind of go for further information and more detail. So with that said, let's jump in. The first page here is the HL7 FHIR Smart App Launch Framework Implementation Guide. So again, an implementation guide, we remember that's something that's kind of laying on top of the core standard. And in this case, we can see up here that we have the HL7 logo and the SMART logo. So that's telling us here that this is an external organization, Smart Health IT, that put this together, but then went through HL7 to get this published and get it officially kind of part of FHIR. So that's important to note up here. This yellow part here is just telling us that which version we're on, and the IG specifically calls out that it can use anything forward. So just to touch briefly, the first thing we want to know is that this is built on top of OAuth 2. So in this section here, it's just telling us, hey, we're using OAuth 2, it's industry standard, it's working well. However, it's very flexible, and that flexibility is great in general, but in this case it would hurt interoperability because no one implements every aspect, every workflow, etc. And so we want to kind of reduce that down into a set that makes sense to use. So that's the goal of what this is doing. It does go through here and say same thing, there's public and confidential apps. So again, according to the OAuth specification, if your application can keep a secret from a user, in that you don't want to be seeing things that are the client application, registration ID, and things like that. So if you have that, if you can keep that secret, so if you're running, for instance, a compiled app on your phone, on your computer, whatever that is, then you're a confidential app. Generally speaking. And then on the other side, if you're running in a web browser, you're generally a public app because you can't really keep a secret from a user in a web browser. So it goes through both of those and defines everything you need. And then it talks about here the two different types of launches we want. And I'm going to jump a little bit here. So we can see the first one here is this EHR launch, and the second one is this standalone launch. The EHR launch is exactly what it sounds like. You're saying, I want to start this application from an existing session in my health record system. So if you have, for instance, a provider that's logged in and now you have an additional application that's going to provide some extra functionality for that provider, they don't need to go through the same authorization steps that a patient does pulling up an app on their phone. And so that's the difference, is the EHR launch is running in the EHR context, and the standalone launch is something that's started externally. So here it's going to go through each of the launch sequences, and they're actually very similar to each other. So again, I don't want to spend too much time here, but you can see in the EHR launch sequence, we're starting from this EHR session. So we're already saying, there's an existing user already doing something in an EHR, and now they're going to ask for something in the app, and then the app can go ask the FHIR server for the metadata. So it can say, again, we talked about this, the capabilities of the FHIR server. That includes something saying, where can I go to get authorization? When the FHIR server comes back with that, the application will go and redirect the user, go through the authorization workflow, and then get its token to continue everything else. The details here, again, there's parameters, everything else. The documentation here is very good, and there are lots of other examples of all of this here. So the standalone launch, we go through the same thing, but you can see here now we're starting from the app. So we don't have an existing EHR context. But we can see it goes through the same process. The app is going to go and ask the FHIR server for its metadata. It's going to say, where can I go to authorize? Then it's going to redirect the user through that workflow and then get its token back when the EHR redirects back to the application. In this case, again, it's just going through the whole workflow in detail, saying go through the authorization. Once it's approved, it redirects back, and now get the token. So first you get the authorization approval, and then you get the actual token. And then once you have the token, you're good to go. You can use that to actually access resources. So there's, again, all the parameters are defined here, and all of the returns are down here as well. Just the things to note, you can see, and again, this is what we were talking about earlier. There are a lot of things, and I won't actually do that, I'll even do it here. There's a lot of these fixed values, and that is what we were talking about, that OAuth has a lot of flexibility, but we said that everyone said, no, let's kind of fix that down a little bit. So in this case, for instance, down here, we're saying the only token type we can have is a bearer token. So very standard in web, very common. Let's standardize on it, and that way people don't have to worry about trying to implement all of these other pieces. It does go through examples, and it even goes through here doing a refresh. So you might have a session that lasts 5 minutes, but a refresh token that's good for an hour. So then the app, if it needs to, can go and keep refreshing and accessing the information. So that's all covered in here, and that's it except for examples. So again, this is the HL7 implementation guide page. But as we said, there's the Smart Health IT. And so actually we can go there, and again, this link will be there, but it's just smarthealthit.org. And so we can see this is the actual project that defined all of this. So the main page here has a lot of information and a lot of good links. I'm going to call out the docs page, and again, I put this link here specifically, but you can see there's the FHIR specification, there's UI, all this different specs and documents. There's several tutorials getting started with browser-based. Then Cerner has one. Epic has similar documentation there. It's just not published on this list. Some different software libraries on how to do all this. Test environments, which we're going to come back to here in a moment. And then sandboxes. Again, all the different major vendors and, well, pretty much everyone who's working on these things provide ways of testing against their servers to make sure things will work. Some require registration, some can do things online directly, and a lot of those are listed back on the test servers as we were talking about in the last episode. The other thing that's really interesting here are the sample apps. Oops, so I actually want to put that back here. And so we can see here that these are just different sample applications that you can look at to see kind of how this works in practice. So kind of the most common application that you're going to see for an example is this growth chart. And you can see it's by Boston Children's Hospital, which is where the Smart Health IT project originated. And so you can see when we view this app, it goes through and talks about it, who it's designed for, what it's compatible with. The source code is available on GitHub, and we can actually go ahead and try the app as well. So this is going through a limited workflow because we're saying we're already in an EHR. So it's just asking us to pick a patient, and then it's going and retrieving all of the FHIR information it needs and drawing, in this case, a nice SVG chart showing us growth rates over the life of the patient, 0 to 20 years in this case. So you can see this is just a completely independent app that an EHR might not have this functionality for charting things out nicely, BMI, weight, length, and showing all of these things in this nice format. And so the idea is you can make this application and just plug it into your EHR. On the flip side, there are the patient-facing apps saying, hey, if you're a patient and you want something like this, you should be able to connect to your EHR and do the same thing. So within the context of the EHR, there's that use case, and then patients or providers externally, there's that use case. So the other big thing, like I said, we were going to get back to, are actually this test environment. So the Smart App Launcher, and you can see here it's saying specifically there's no registration required, and that brings us to this page. And this page is, again, a very generic testing utility. I don't know if generic is the best word there, but it's very flexible in that it'll let you test everything, and then it doesn't obviously provide tons of functionality beyond that because this is to test the actual smart workflow. So you can see here we're back. We have the same types of options. We have EHR launches and standalone launches, and we have patients versus providers. Back-end service and CDS hook service are completely different things, which we can get to in a later series. So in this case, for instance, if we said we want to do a patient standalone launch, in this case, we need to pick a FHIR server. So we're picking an R4 server that's here. And now we don't normally pick a patient beforehand, obviously, depending on how you will. But in this case, the server uses these IDs, and they're pretty annoying to memorize. So we can just pre-populate it here. These advanced options here are to skip the different authorization and login screens. And that's as you're testing the actual workflow of the app. You don't necessarily want to click all the login buttons every time. And so this just bypasses that and basically says everything went normally, everything was approved, and here's the redirect. So it lets you kind of tighten the loop. It's great for when you're developing these things. You can also simulate errors. Again, as you're developing your app, you might want to check and see that you're behaving properly. So what this does is it actually generates this kind of proxy around this FHIR server. And that's what all this stuff is, just encoding that information here. So we can test this with a sample app, but before we do that, we can even take this back. Oops, and we already had one here because I was testing this beforehand. But we can see here, we tried to go to that FHIR server, and we got this operation outcome. This is pretty familiar to us by now. This is the base URL of the FHIR server. So we want to get the metadata for the FHIR server, and then we did. So here's the capability statement with everything else. Now, this is what we were talking about before. You can see in the capabilities, in addition to just saying things like, oh, the software version and what resources we support and everything else, this FHIR server is telling us we have this extension that has OAuth URIs. So we have our authorization endpoint and our token endpoint. So again, those were the different steps we were talking about. You go through and get the authorization code, and then you use that code to get a token. And so we need, as a client application, to discover where these endpoints are, and this is how you do that. So if we come back to the Smart App Launcher, we have a sample app here that we can test with. So you can see this is just copied from the previous screen, and this changes depending on the options there, so we'll see that in a minute. Then we're going to ask for different scopes. So we're going to say, what are we trying to do with this? So in this case, for instance, the checkbox is here. We're saying we want access to everything in the user scope, everything in the patient scope. And again, this is the same thing. If we were, since we're trying to simulate a patient app, user scope generally wouldn't be allowed or granted. So we can turn that off here for a minute and say, okay, we want access to let's say we just want access to read patients, and then here we want to know the patient and encounter that this was launched with. So when we run this, you can see now we're on a different page, and they thankfully changed the background colors here so you can tell kind of which area of the UI you're in. So in this case, we're back to the blue, so we're back to this patient portal. So we were on the green page asking us, that's the app we were using, and now we're actually going through the authorization. We have our user ID and password, and it's warning us, telling us, hey, this is fake, so it doesn't really matter. When we log in, it's going to tell us, and this is an important step here, it's going to say, hey, this is what the application is asking to do. It wants to read your profile, your medical information, the current encounter, the current patient. If we go back and ask for write access, those will show up here. And this kind of gives the user a more plain language way of understanding what the app is trying to do. In this case, we want to approve it. And so you can see we're back in our sample app, back on green. And now we can see all this information it came back with. And again, this, the growth chart was a great example of the type of thing you can do. This is more of a developer tool showing all the information we need to actually work with these. So you can see, first we have this access token response. And so it gave us all this information back. You can see there's a patient. Here there's a patient and an ID. There's an encounter and an ID. Smart style URL, all of these things that are part of the app launch sequence. We also have this ID token, which is a Java Web token, and you can see it's encrypted, or it's signed, I apologize, and then it has all the profile, audience, subject, issuer, issued at time, expiration time, etc. In this case, we do have a refresh token as well. And so this is saying, even though it expires in however long this is, what is that, probably 5 minutes, something like that, maybe longer. Expires in 60 minutes. So it's set for an hour right now. So, but we do have this refresh token that we can use to extend it. So you can see here, actually, if we click refresh, we're going to keep getting different times right here in the issued at and expiration, and we're going to keep getting different refresh tokens. We haven't changed anything that we're asking for, we're just refreshing and extending our access. So here you can see we asked for patient read, and so here it very helpfully gave us the patient resource that we had asked for, and this is just the JSON version. You can see pretty printed. That it's the resource and the text and everything else. So this was the patient we had selected and logged in as. We did not ask for a user scope, so it did not give us any user information. And we did ask to know which encounter this was for. Now, we didn't pick an encounter here, so the server actually went and said, what's the most recent encounter, I believe, is the default it gives you. But it's all fake data in this case. You can see this is Cynthia, synthetic data, which is a great tool for generating data like that, but it just picked one. So you can see that kind of goes through the whole workflow starting from the app. So if you remember, when we came here and said we were doing a patient standalone, when we came to the app, we are running the sample app. So that's what we wanted to start with. You can also go on this launcher and say, I want to start with the provider EHR launch. We'll make it look like we're in the EHR. And we can even go ahead and pick, for instance, a provider. Just pick the first provider, and we'll go from there. So you can see here, we have all these same options. We have an open FHIR server endpoint, a protected FHIR server endpoint. We have providers, all these different things. But now when we go and test with the sample app, you can see, and again, it's helpfully colored differently so we can see that we're in a different section, but now we're in an EHR, and it's just simulated EHR. In this case, we're trying to launch an app, and it said we need a patient. So we'll pick a patient, and now you can see this green. So we're back in the same smart app that we were, because that's the sample that we're using. so that we can output all this same information. But in this case, we were inside the EHR, so we went through a slightly different flow. It wasn't prompting us in plain language what we were trying to see or any of those things, because we're already in an EHR. So there are a lot of assumptions that the workflow can make as far as saying, I don't need to say, explain what reading a patient record is or any of those types of things. So it's a very different workflow. We never actually logged in because we were already logged into the EHR as a provider, right? So we picked that here and said we are logged in as this provider, so we don't have to go through and log in or do any of those other steps. There we go. So with that said, I think that covers most of everything just as an overview that you can go through and start testing and kind of see how everything works. Again, there's a lot of documentation here, and I highly recommend going through and getting more in depth, but I won't reinvent the wheel here. So with that said, if there's things that would have been helpful to include here that are harder to find or anything else, please let me know in the comments or on Zulip. Otherwise, look forward to hopefully getting into some code in the next session. So thanks, hope this helps, and cheers.